In this video, I'm going to share with you my predictions for the topics that are most likely to be in paper 1 AQA GCSE chemistry exam 2025. And this is for separate science, not for combined science. I will post a different video for combined science. These predictions come from the analysis of the trends and the questions over the past 5 years, including last year, 2024. And I came up with these predictions. First, topics which are almost in every exam, and they are most likely will be in your exam this year. The first topic is making soluble salt. There have always been a question about making soluble salt from insoluble base and a dilute acid, either by planning an experiment or by giving you the steps of the preparation and then asking you different questions about that. So make sure that you know how to make soluble salt. And then there will always be a question about acid. They like to ask about weak acids and the difference between weak and strong acids. Also, they like to ask about the difference in the diluted and concentrated acids, how the different types and different concentration of acids affect the pH of the solution. Sometimes they ask you to calculate the pH based on the change in the concentration as well. And when they ask about acid, there will always be a question about titration. So titration will always be in the exam. And when we talk about titration, we have to talk about calculation because when they ask about acid-base titration, there will be a question about calculating the concentration from titration. So make sure that you know how to use the different equations to do that. And also, some of the very common calculation questions are calculation of the volume of a gas in a reaction and also calculation of the relative atomic mass from the masses of the different isotopes. And if they ask you this, they most probably going to ask you to define what is an isotope. Exothermic and endothermic reaction. Usually, the question comes with an energy profile, and they ask you either to draw the energy profile of a certain reaction they provide you with, or to label it. So make sure that you know how to label the activation energy and the overall energy change. And sometimes they give you the labeled diagram or the labeled energy profile, which is incorrect, and ask you to make corrections for the mistakes within the energy profile. Also, it's very common to ask you to calculate the enthalpy change from the bond energies. Electrolysis will definitely be in the exam. The most common electrolysis question is electrolysis of aqueous ionic compounds. So make sure that you know which cation is going to be reduced at the cathode and which anion is going to be oxidized at the anode and using the aqueous ionic compound. Sometimes they also ask about the electrolysis of molten ionic compound, but the most common one is the aqueous ionic compounds. And then periodic table and trends, there will always be question about periodic table. And when they ask about periodic table, usually they tend to ask about the different trends in group 1, group 7, and group 0 or noble gases. They can ask about physical or chemical properties in the trend. But I think this year, most probably they're going to ask about chemical properties because last year there was more focus on the trend and the physical properties. Group 1 reactions, especially reaction with water and hydrodilute acids, make the reaction with water is the most common one. However, sometimes they also ask about reaction with dilute acids. Just make sure that you know both reactions. And then displacement reactions as a type of a redox reaction. So displacement reaction is when a metal displaces another one from its salts. And when they ask about that, it's usually they're going to ask about redox, which one is oxidized, which one is reduced, and why, and also ask you to complete an ionic equation for the displacement reaction. And then there will be a question always about bonding, ionic, covalent, and metallic. topic, they might ask you to compare between different compounds or between different substances, their physical property, their melting points based on their bonding, or they might ask you to draw the dot and cross diagram for a certain compound, either ionic or covalent. Last year, there was no dot and cross diagram, and it usually features in the exam every other year. So my prediction, there might be a question about that this year, especially it might be for ionic compound, because last time they asked you to, or asked the students to draw a dot and cross diagram, it was for a covalent compound. So my prediction is to have a question dot and cross diagram for an ionic compound. And then finally, plan an experiment. So planning an experiment, it's going to be completely different every single year. So they never repeat the same question. However, it shouldn't be a very difficult question because you just need to look at the different variables and make sure that you define these variables and use them correctly in your experiment. So the control variables, which are kept constant, the independent variable, which is the one that you are going to change yourself every time, and then the dependent variable, which you are going to measure at the end. So if you know your variables, you know which ones to keep constants, which one you vary, and which one you measure, then you should be able to plan your experiment correctly. And then topics which are, in my prediction, are most likely to be in the exam this year because they are quite common and they haven't been in the exam last year. The first one is giant covalent structure and carbon allotropes. So last year there was nothing about giant covalent structure. There was a question about simple covalent structures, or simple covalent compound, but there was nothing about giant covalent structure. So make sure that you cover this topic properly, you know all of the giant covalent structures. And then the carbon allotropes, if they ask you about fullerene, then they're going to ask about nanoparticles. So make sure that you know this very well as well. Evaluation question. So the AQA exam board for the GCSE always like to ask these type of questions. So they provide you with a table and they ask you to evaluate something. So something like the use of certain metals for conduction of electricity or different methods of extraction metals or whatever. So they're gonna ask something, most probably it's gonna be a new thing that never featured in the exam before. All what you need to do is to look at the data, do some analysis, see what are the pros and cons for each of these, and then just enumerate these in your answer and compare between them. And then we have a group 7 elements, especially the reactivity trend and the displacement reaction, which hasn't been in the exam lately. So just make sure that you cover this as well. The use of Avogadro constant to calculate number of atoms or particles as well was very common and it hasn't been in the exam last year. So make sure that you are able to use Avogadro constant to calculate the number of atoms or particles. And finally, metals, non-metals, and transition metals. So there was nothing last year about transition metals. Just make sure that you know the difference between metals and transition metals, especially the difference in the physical and chemical properties. There are topics which are common, but they are not in every exam. These include the atom calculation of atom economy, the calculation of percentage yield, the model of the atom, very, very common, but it's not always in the exam. It has been in the exam last year. Maybe it will be in the exam again this year because it's quite common, and also Mendeleev table. And finally, the electrochemical cells and hydrogen fuel cells. Electrochemical cells, if it comes in the exam this year, my expectation or my prediction that it's not going to be a very long question because last year there was a very long question about electrochemical cells, including planning and experiment. I don't think they're going to repeat similar question again this year, but if it features in the exam this year, probably it's going to be embedded within the electrolysis question. They might ask you that what is the difference between electrolysis and chemical cells. Just make sure that you understand this concept and make sure that you understand how hydrogen fuel cell works. And finally, I want you to pay attention to the following topics because they haven't featured in the exam over the last 4 years. The first one is limiting reagents. The second one is the law of conservations of mass. And finally, states of matters and the particle model. So these haven't been in the exam. Just make sure that you at least know these because they may decide this year it's about time to ask you questions about these topics.